Guys, one more video. Apologize for my absence again today. Little dude's home with the flu. So we're going to pick up here. I know it's a little repeat for some of us as we got through this today, but not all of us did. So just a quick recap with the Suez Crisis. Remember, it's Nasser playing the Soviet Union and the United States off of each other, and it gets pretty tense over control of the canal to fund construction of the Aswan Dam, as promised by Secretary of State Dulles. The British and the French, along with the Israelis, invade to kick the Egyptians out of the Suez. Eisenhower, of course, was not happy with this, as we stated. Too blatant, out in the open. The United States was kept in the dark. So the U.S. does not come to help. It is the first UN action, this in 1956, the first Sinai War, as it's sometimes referred to. But Egypt is kicked out. The British and the French, along with Israel, are removed from the region. It is the real last time that the British and the French will get involved to intervene in world affairs, while it's the first time the UN takes action. So it takes until 1956 that we see that from the United States, from the United Nations. And let's see, after this, we mentioned the reasons for the development of the Eisenhower Doctrine, basically because of that growing tension in the Middle East. Similar to Truman Doctrine, this applies directly to the Middle East and also guarantees military aid, where the Truman Doctrine focused on funding through avenues like the Marshall Plan. The first place this was applied was in Lebanon in 1957. The U.S. pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country. There was a civil war in Lebanon in 1958. Christian faction fighting with a Muslim faction. No lives were lost by the United States. This was 1958. The threat here, however, was mostly nationalism, not communism. But with the threat of communist intervention, the Eisenhower administration does get involved without losing any lives, without any casualties on the United States side. 1960, we see the Middle East kind of react and organize to navigate that very difficult path we were talking about in this Cold War era, these early Cold War years, trying to figure out not only their independence, their national identity to international identity, and work between this very hostile conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So one answer to that by the Third World is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, formed in 1960. Really is a way to set oil prices around the world. We did say that by the 1950s, the United States was not exporting as much oil. It was now an importer of oil with the growing demand at home. And the Third World here in the Middle East takes advantage of their resources, organizes, including, you can see some countries from outside the region, to set and control oil prices throughout the world. We will see the power of OPEC in the late 70s and the crisis that it causes here in the United States. But over the next couple of decades, the growing Western dependence on oil, Arab nationalism, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Middle East becomes very, very tense. And again, we'll visit that with many future presidents. Really up to the present day, still tense in that region now. And with that, we'll turn to the U.S.-Soviet relations in the 1950s and begin with the loss of Uncle Joe on March 5th, 1953. Stalin is dead. A total shift in leadership with the Soviet Union, some better, some worse. But without Stalin, there was a power void there. Many different leaders emerged. We're going to focus on really two in the interim. Bulganin was his name, and Khrushchev. You'll see the spellings in a moment. But clearly, nothing's more important to U.S. security than the relationship with the Soviet Union. And having worked with Stalin during World War II, a lot of questions were present for the United States with his passing. So during Eisenhower's two terms, fluctuation with this relationship, some very extremely tense moments, and some periods of relative calm, which we'll talk about today. But the two immediate leaders you see here, Nikolai Bulganin, who's followed by Nikita Khrushchev, and without too much of an explanation about upper leadership within the Soviet system, we've got a chairman of the Council of Ministers who really acts like a prime minister, and that's where Bulganin fits in. And then there is a premier, which was Uncle Joe Stalin's position, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, and that's where we see Khrushchev emerge in by 1955. So before we talk about this image here, there was a little revolt in Hungary. We will mention what was called the Spirit of Geneva, a result of the Geneva Summit of 1955. Make sure to distinguish between the Geneva Conference of 54 regarding Vietnam. The following year, some international leaders, Britain, France, United States, Russia, got together in Geneva again to discuss world peace. So it's July 18 of 1955. Stalin's dead. Two countries trying to figure out where they're going to go and where they both fit in. So at this juncture, 1955, Eisenhower is calling for a slowdown in the arms race. And the Soviet Union showed signs of reducing tension as well and agreeing with that slowdown in arms production. And they had already withdrawn troops from Austria. The Soviet Union had established peace with Greece and with Turkey, two incidents, remember, that led to the Truman Doctrine previously. At this conference in 1955, the Geneva Summit, a few things, key things happen. One, both sides kind of agree to reduce the tension overall across the globe and work peacefully and to manage peace throughout the world. Eisenhower, however, called for open skies. He wanted Bulganin to agree to open skies, basically letting either side have access to the skies above for spy flights, aerial reconnaissance, aerial surveillance flights, just to ensure that the opposing nation was not planning everything and to help prevent any sort of surprise nuclear attacks. Key to note that in 1955 that is rejected by the Soviet Union. And we'll see why in a few minutes here, just 5 years later, that blows up into an international incident where the United States gets themselves into a little trouble. But the result of this Spirit of Geneva, this Geneva Summit of 55, really the first thaw in the Cold War, the first time of relative peace, the first time where both sides kind of agreed to take a step back, reduce tensions, and kind of support a peaceful coexistence. However, it will not last long. We see here October of 1956, an image of the Hungarian revolt. So what happens here? The Hungarians overthrow the communist government. They want to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, and they want the Russians to go home. So Khrushchev, his response here is rapid and is brutal. You can see the Soviet tanks roll in. The freedom fighters, as they were called, were crushed after doing some damage to poor Joseph Stalin's statue there. But Eisenhower does not intervene. If we think back to Dulles' statement of this new look of foreign policy to liberate the captive peoples, it is interesting to point out that the Eisenhower administration does not get involved. Going back seemingly 180 degrees on that policy of liberating the captive peoples, Eisenhower decides not to. Feels like that intervention would spark a huge war across all of Europe, not just in Hungary. So with this incident, the rebellion is crushed. The communist Soviet Union reinstall their authority in that region. It ends the thaw. It ends the spirit uh, of Geneva, and it ends Dulles' rhetoric of liberating the captive people in this region and then consequently uh, throughout the world. Growing tensions after that. 1957, October 4th, 1957 was the first Sputnik shown here. That's Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. It shook the world when the Soviets launched Sputnik, this 184-pound satellite. The next month, in November, the Soviets will answer again. Sputnik 2, 1,100-pound satellite with a Husky Terrier in there named Laikin, Laikin. So with this, I mean, it's a space race. It's like a technological race, but there's global nuclear warfare implications. The major fear with Sputnik was that if the Soviets could put this into space, they could create missiles and rockets. They could get warheads to the United States quicker, more accurately, and more effectively. So the growing tension here is not just the race to the moon, which, of course, as you know, the United States wins and owns to this day, but there is shattered confidence here in the United States. It put the Soviet Union ahead scientifically. And the Soviets used this politically. They politicized their victories, they criticized the United States and the United States' attempts and failures, and keeping their own failures secret, of course. But there was a rapid answer. Within 4 months post Sputnik, the United States put a grapefruit-sized 2.5-pound satellite into orbit, and then of course from there, the space program in the United States will no pun intended, skyrocket and quickly take over. So the first reaction by Congress in 1957 is the National Defense and Education Act, NDEA, showing a conservative reaction. If we think back to our political spectrum, the NDEA of 1957 appropriated $887 million from Congress to fund U.S. education in science and foreign languages, noting the importance of international affairs, studying abroad, and bringing information home. So again, that's 1957, NDEA, $887 million. The very next year, in 58, Congress will organize the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA, National Aeronautic and Space Administration, to focus on missile construction, exploring outer space. Billions and billions of dollars have been appropriated to compete with the Soviet Union, initially in this space race, and then beyond. But the major impact of Sputnik is increased fear here in America. Thinking back to our friend Bert the Turtle, he becomes much more relevant, and his message is much more important with the Soviet initial success. Of course, by 1969, with Apollo 11, we will land on the moon. Those are American golf balls brought on the moon by that first Apollo mission 11 to land there. That date was July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong, of course, being the first to step on the moon. Buzz Aldrin was there with him. Michael Collins stayed in the command capsule, orbiting until that lunar module was prepared to take everyone back home. But make no mistake, it's a United States moon, and we should all be proud to own a little sliver of that. So, having won the space race, you can see here an American footprint. Spirit of St. Louis, the old first transatlantic plane, also came from the United States. Let's turn to more increased tension. And we'll specifically mention the Second Berlin Crisis of 1958, which of course references the Berlin airlift that we've discussed previously being the first Berlin Crisis. So this here is the second. With the new confidence from Sputnik, Khrushchev's confidence increased tremendously. And you can see here with his quote, uh, thinking that they have a leg up, foolishly, he decides to announce to the world that he's going to bury capitalism. Well, the USSR at that point uh, gave the West 6 months to get all troops out of West Berlin, which you recall is well within East Germany, well within Soviet-controlled territory. So the demand in response to Sputnik from the Soviet Union was to kick the West out of Berlin. And of course, the United States refused. Um, there's no way Eisenhower was going to pull out of Berlin because of Khrushchev's aggressive demand. In 1959, the president invited Khrushchev to Camp David, a presidential retreat in Maryland. And Eisenhower and Khrushchev agreed to put off the Second Berlin Crisis and meet again in Paris in 1960. So, two creepy grandpas. And at the Camp David meeting, again, it's 1959, it's agreed. The Berlin Crisis will be put off. It's really not mentioned. It kind of just dies down. They agree to discuss it later on in Paris in 1960. They continue to talk about halting nuclear tests and reducing the arms race here at the Camp David meeting in 1959. However, 2 weeks prior to that Paris meeting, on May 1st, 1960, the Soviets shoot down a United States U-2 spy plane, shown here. Francis Gary Powers, was the pilot. He survives. He was unable to launch the self-destruct mechanism. He's captured by the KGB and arrested, of course, for espionage. And this, on May 1st, the summit meeting was scheduled for May 16th. So, in response to this, the Soviets capture the pilot, Francis Gary Powers. They announce to the world that they've got the plane, that they shot the plane down. But they do not reveal that they had the pilot. So, assuming that Francis Gary Powers followed the standard operating procedure, the self-destruct mechanism, the United States boldly announced that they were missing a weather plane from Turkey. Khrushchev then answers, having set up the United States perfectly, one could argue, announces to the world that they have the pilot and that he is alive and kicking, and catches Eisenhower and the United States State Department in a lie. May 11th, Eisenhower took personal responsibility. He said it's time to endure the storm. The open skies was rejected in 1955. The U.S. had been secretly then gaining information and spying on the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower took full responsibility for it and announced that he's aware of what's happened. Agrees to continue the meeting on the 16th of May, which lasted a brief 45 minutes. The story goes Khrushchev walked into the meeting on May 16th, lambasted Eisenhower for 45 minutes, just yelling and criticizing, got up and left. So the U-2 summit meeting, as it goes down in reference to the U-2 spy plane that was shot down by the Soviet Union, nothing really happens. The spirit of Camp David is over. It did not last long. Increased tension for the Cold War after this. Powers again tried for espionage, of course convicted, sent to 10 years in jail. He'll later be exchanged for a Soviet spy. After only 21 months, the United States will get him back by exchanging a Soviet spy that had been arrested in the United States. We may have seen the story, the Tom Hanks film, The Bridge of Spies, just last year depicted this U-2 incident. But, the result, spirit of Camp David again, dead, increased tension. Things got much worse in 1959 when communism came to Cuba. Perhaps the most alarming Cold War event during the Eisenhower administration, which of course Kennedy's going to use during the 1960 campaign, that the fact that the Republicans let communism come to Cuba right in our backyard. After saying that the previous Democratic administration, Truman, was too soft on communism. So we get this turn of events again in 1959. And we must remember Guatemala, and we must remember the turning point in Latin American United States relations after the Havana Conference of 1940, which we mentioned established a collective security type of agreement against growing European aggression with the rise of the dictators in World War II. So, early 50s, the CIA continues to back coups supporting brutal dictators, Guatemala, for example. Billions of dollars from the United States are going to Europe, and only millions are going to Cuba, a third world country trying to develop, not getting the attention from the United States that they thought they deserved. So we see the emergence of Fidel Castro, Fidel Castro. It's 1959 again. He overthrows the Democratic of sorts leader Batista, Batista, and denounces United States imperialism. He denounces United States support and outright says, Castro this that he is seeking support from the Soviet Union. Clearly from this picture, it's welcomed by Khrushchev. Castro will go on quickly to nationalize U.S. businesses. Remember, taking over industries and running them through the government. He'll nationalize U.S. properties and again seek aid from the Soviet Union. The United States response to this, again, highly criticized by JFK during the campaign. Eisenhower cut off trade to the island of Cuba, especially that same crop that we talked about in 1898, sugar. Here's where we get the ban on Cuban cigars, which will lead. This event will lead to that very quickly as we put more economic sanctions on Cuba for being communist. Eisenhower here also thinks about invoking the Monroe Doctrine. Communism's only 90 minutes away. The Soviet response to that consideration by Eisenhower to invoke the Monroe Doctrine was that doctrine is dead. Remember, this is a whole new world order after 1941 that has just become more complex since that point. By 1959, Khrushchev proclaims Monroe Doctrine's dead, and that if the United States decides to invoke that dead doctrine, he would shower missiles down upon the United States if we attack his friend Fidel Castro. So clearly, Monroe Doctrine is not instituted at that juncture. Many, hundreds of thousands of Cubans will flee, anti-Castro Cubans, anti-communist Cubans, flooding into Florida. Between 1960 and 1990, 750,000 Cuban refugees will flood into Florida, escaping communism. Those that did early on will organize with the CIA for a Bay of Pigs invasion. So under the Eisenhower administration, that invasion is planned. We'll talk more about it under Kennedy, who's forced to decide whether or not to do it. He does after some bad intelligence and ends up taking the hit for it. But the covert operation, like the others we've discussed in Guatemala and Iran, that is organized, and the intent is to go ahead with that under the Eisenhower administration, under the Dulles leadership in the State Department. It is left for John F. Kennedy to decide whether or not to do that, and we'll go into detail as we approach his administration. In 1961, the United States breaks relations with Cuba. Again, we'll talk more with President Kennedy. But it is Eisenhower, you should note, who authorized the CIA to train those anti-communist Cuban exiles, to retake Cuba with U.S. support, with CIA support. So I think we'll break there for today. We'll start with America in the 1950s, the Civil Rights Movement on Friday. It is important to note again, though, at this juncture here, 1959, communism in Cuba, Sputnik, they beat us to space. The aggressive repelling of the revolt in Hungary, it does appear to some, especially with the disaster of the U-2 spy plane, that the communists are winning the Cold War by 1959. To some in the United States, it felt that way. Of course, the true American patriots, there's no question, but the the point is, tension is growing greatly by the time Eisenhower leaves, although there was no hot conflicts, as he liked to call them, although not one man, no one soldier was lost during his reign. So again, we'll turn to this upon return on Friday, addressing the civil rights of the 1950s and some popular culture. We'll get to Elvis and all that cool stuff. I do see a test in our future Monday, Tuesday, most likely Tuesday, Wednesday. We'll see how we do the rest of the way. So thank you, and I will see you soon.